Hellhounds, chase ghosts, come sleep, watch out, demons are coming, run, sleep, hide, spirits, ghosts, hide, demons, hellhounds, ghosts, demons are coming, spirits, ghosts.
Welcome home, my little hellhounds. Tonight we're doing a part 2 of the Ted Bundy killings. If you want more episodes on Ted Bundy, then leave a like and don't forget to subscribe so you know when the next Ted Bundy episode is up. Now let's get right into it. Arrest and first trial. On August 16th, 1975, Bundy was arrested by Utah Highway Patrol Officer Bob Haywood in Granger, another Salt Lake City suburb. Haywood observed Bundy cruising a residential area in the pre-dawn hours and fleeing at high speed. After seeing the patrol car, Haywood noticed that the Volkswagen's front passenger seat had been removed and placed on the rear seats, and searched the car. He found a ski mask, a second mask fashioned from pantyhose, a crowbar, handcuffs, trash bags, a coil of rope, an ice pick, and other items initially assumed to be burglary tools. Bundy explained that the ski mask was for skiing. He had found the handcuffs in a dumpster, and the rest were common household items. However, Detective Jerry Thompson remembered a similar suspect and car description from the November 1974 Durange kidnapping and Bundy's name from Clover's December 1974 phone call. In a search of Bundy's apartment, police found a guide to Colorado ski resorts with a check mark by the Wildwood Inn and a brochure that advertised the Viewmont High School play in Bountiful, where Deborah Kent had disappeared. The police did not have sufficient evidence to detain Bundy, and he was released on his own reconnaissance. Bundy later said that searchers missed a hidden collection of Polaroid photographs of his victims, which he destroyed after he was released. Salt Lake City police placed Bundy on 24-hour surveillance, and Thompson flew to Seattle with 2 other detectives to interview Clover. She told them that in the year prior to Bundy's move to Utah, she had discovered objects that she couldn't understand in her house and in Bundy's apartment. These items included crutches, a bag of plaster of Paris that he admitted stealing from a medical supply house, and a meat cleaver that was never used for cooking. Additional objects included surgical gloves, an oriental knife in a wooden case that he kept in his glove compartment, and a sack full of women's clothing. Bundy was perpetually in debt, and Clover suspected that he had stolen almost everything of significant value that he possessed. When she confronted him over a new TV and stereo, he warned her, "If you tell anyone, I'll break your fucking neck." She said Bundy became very upset whenever she considered cutting her hair, which was long and parted in the middle. She would sometimes awaken in the middle of the night to find him under the bed covers with a flashlight, examining her body. He kept a lug wrench taped halfway up the handle in the trunk of her car, another Volkswagen Beetle, and he often borrowed for protection. The detectives confirmed that Bundy had not been with Clover on any of the nights during which the Pacific Northwest victims had vanished, nor on the day Ott and Naslund were abducted. Shortly thereafter, Clover was interviewed by a Seattle homicide detective, Kathy McChesney, and learned of the existence of Stephanie Brooks and her brief engagement to Bundy around Christmas. In September, Bundy sold his Volkswagen Beetle to a Midvale teenager. Utah police impounded it, and FBI technicians dismantled and searched it. They found hairs matching samples obtained from Karen Campbell's body. Later, they also identified hair strands microscopically indistinguishable from those of Melissa Smith and Carol DeRonge. FBI lab specialist Robert Neal concluded that the presence of hair strands in one car matching 3 different victims who had never met one another would be a coincidence of mind-boggling rarity. On October 2nd, detectives put Bundy into a lineup. DeRonge immediately identified him as Officer Roseland, and witnesses from Bountiful recognized him as the stranger at the high school auditorium. There was insufficient evidence to link him to Deborah Kent, whose body was never found, though a skeletal fragment found near the school was later identified as Kent's by DNA analysis. There was more than enough evidence to charge him with aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault in the DeRonge case. He was freed on $15,000 bail paid by his parents, and spent most of the time between indictment and trial in Seattle, living in Clover's house. Seattle police had insufficient evidence to charge him in the Pacific Northwest murders, but kept him under close surveillance. When Ted and I stepped out on the porch to go somewhere, Clover wrote, "So many unmarked police cars started up that it sounded like the beginning of the Indy 500. In November, the 3 principal Bundy investigators, Jerry Thompson from Utah, Robert Keppel from Washington, and Michael Fisher from Colorado, met in Aspen, Colorado, and exchanged information with 30 detectives and prosecutors from 5 states, while officials left the meeting, later known as the Aspen Summit, convinced that Bundy was the murderer they sought. They agreed that more hard evidence would be needed before he could be charged with any of the murders. In February 1976, Bundy stood trial for the DeRonge kidnapping. On the advice of his attorney, John O'Connell, Bundy waived his right to a jury due to the negative publicity surrounding the case. After a 4-day bench trial and a weekend of deliberation, Judge Stuart Hanson Jr. found him guilty of kidnapping and assault. In June, he was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in the Utah State Prison. In October, he was found hiding in bushes in the prison yard, carrying an escape kit, road maps, airline schedules, and a social security card, and spent several weeks in solitary confinement. Later that month, Colorado authorities charged him with Karen Campbell's murder. After a period of resistance, he waived extradition proceedings and was transferred to Aspen in January 1977. Escapes. On June 7th, 1977, Bundy was transported 40 miles from the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs to Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen for a preliminary hearing. He had elected to serve as his own attorney, and as such was excused by the judge from wearing handcuffs or leg shackles. During a recess, he asked to visit the courthouse's law library to research his case. Well shielded from his guard's view behind a bookcase, he opened a window and jumped to the ground from the second story, injuring his right ankle as he landed. After shedding an outer layer of clothing, he walked through Aspen as roadblocks were being set up on its outskirts, then hiked southward onto Aspen Mountain near its summit. He broke into a hunting cabin and stole food, clothing and a rifle. The following day, he left the cabin and continued toward the town of Crested Butte, but became lost in the forest. For 2 days, he wandered aimlessly on the mountain, missing 2 trails that led downward to his intended destination. On June 10th, he broke into a camping trailer on Maroon Lake, 10 miles south of Aspen, taking food and a ski parka. But instead of continuing southward, he walked back north toward Aspen, eluding roadblocks and search parties along the way. 3 days later, he stole a car at the edge of Aspen Golf Course. Cold, sleep-deprived, and in constant pain from his sprained ankle, he drove back into Aspen, where 2 police officers noticed his car weaving in and out of its lane and pulled him over. He had been a fugitive for 6 days. In the car were maps of the mountain area around Aspen that prosecutors were using to demonstrate the location of Karen Campbell's body. As his own attorney, Bundy had the rights of discovery, indicating that his escape was not a spontaneous act, but had been planned. Back in jail in Glenwood Springs, Bundy ignored the advice of friends and legal advisors to stay put. The case against him, already weak at best, was deteriorating steadily as praetorial motions consistently resolved in his favour, and significant bits of evidence were ruled inadmissible. A more rational defendant might have realised that he stood a good chance of acquittal, and that beating the murder charge in Colorado would probably have dissuaded other prosecutors. With as little as a year and a half to serve on the Derange conviction, had Ted Bundy persevered, he could have been a free man. Instead, Bundy assembled a new escape plan. He acquired a detailed floor plan of the jail and a hacksaw blade from other inmates, and accumulated $500 in cash, smuggled in over a 6-month period. He later said, by visitors, Carol Ann Boone in particular. During the evenings, while other prisoners were showering, he sawed a hole about 1 square foot between the steel reinforcing bars in his cell's ceiling, and having lost 35 pounds, he was able to wriggle through it into the crawl space above. In the weeks that followed, he made a series of practice runs, exploring the space. Multiple reports from an informant of movement within the ceiling during the night were not investigated. By late 1977, Bundy's impending trial had become a cause célèbre in the small town of Aspen, and Bundy filed a motion for a change of venue to Denver. On December 23rd, the Aspen trial judge granted the request, but to Colorado Springs, where juries had historically been hostile to murder suspects, on the night of December 30th, with most of the jail staff on Christmas break and non-violent prisoners on furlough with their families. Bundy piled books and files in his bed, covered them with a blanket to simulate his sleeping body, and climbed into the crawl space. He broke through the ceiling into the apartment of the chief jailer, who was out for the evening with his wife, changed into street clothes from the jailer's closet, and walked out the front door to freedom. After stealing the car, Bundy drove eastward out of Glenwood Springs, but the car soon broke down in the mountains on Interstate 70. A passing motorist gave him a ride into Vail, 60 miles to the east. From there he caught a bus to Denver, where he boarded a morning flight to Chicago. In Glenwood Springs, the jail's skeleton crew did not discover the escape until noon on December 31st, more than 17 hours later. By then, Bundy was already in Chicago, Florida. From Chicago, Bundy traveled by train to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where he was present in a local tavern on January 2nd, 5 days later. He stole a car and drove to Atlanta, where he boarded a bus and arrived in Tallahassee, Florida, on the morning of January 8th. He rented a room under the alias Chris Hagen at the Holiday Inn near the Florida State University campus. Bundy later said that he initially resolved to finding legitimate employment and refrain from further criminal activity, knowing he could probably remain free and undetected in Florida's indefinitely, as long as he did not attract the attention of the police. But his lone job application at a construction site had to be abandoned when he was asked to produce identification. He reverted to his old habits of shoplifting and stealing credit cards from women's wallets left in the shopping carts. In the early hours of January 15th, 1978, 1 week after his arrival in Tallahassee, Bundy entered FSU's Chiamoga sorority house through a rear door with a faulty locking mechanism. Beginning at about 2:45 a.m, he bludgeoned Margaret Bowman, 21, with a piece of oak firewood as she slept, then garroted her with a nylon stocking. He then entered the bedroom of 20-year-old Lisa Levy and beat her unconscious, strangled her, tore one of her nipples off, bit deeply into her left buttock, and sexually assaulted her with a hair mist bottle. In an adjoining bedroom, he attacked Kathy Kleiner, breaking her jaw and deeply lacerating her shoulder, and Karen Chandler, who suffered a concussion, broken jaw, loss of teeth, and a crushed finger. Chandler and Kleiner survived the attack. Kleiner later attributed their survival to automobile headlights illuminating the interior of their room and frightening away the attacker. Tallahassee detectives later determined that the 4 attacks took place in a total of less than 15 minutes, within earshot of more than 30 witnesses who heard nothing. After leaving the sorority house, Bundy broke into a basement apartment 8 blocks away and attacked FSU student Cheryl Thomas, dislocating her shoulder and fracturing her jaw and skull in 5 places. She was left with permanent deafness and equilibrium damage that ended her dance career. On Thomas's bed, police found a semen stain and a pantyhose mask containing 2 hairs similar to Bundy's in class and characteristic. On February 8th, Bundy drove 150 miles east of Jacksonville in a stolen FSU van. In a parking lot, he approached 14-year-old Leslie Parmenter, the daughter of Jacksonville Police Department Chief of Detectives, identifying himself as Richard Burton, Fire Department, but retreated when Parmenter's older brother arrived and challenged him. That afternoon, he backtracked 60 miles westward to Lake City. At Lake City Junior High School, the following morning, 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach was summoned to her homeroom by a teacher to retrieve a forgotten purse. She never returned to class. 7 weeks later, after an intensive search, her partially mummified remains were found in a pig farrowing shed near Suwannee River State Park, 35 miles northwest of Lake City. She appeared to have been raped, then killed by neck lacerations with a knife. On February 12th, with insufficient cash to pay his overdue rent and a growing suspicion that police were closing in on him, Bundy stole a car and fled Tallahassee, driving westward across the Florida Panhandle. 3 days later, at around 1 a.m., he was stopped by Pensacola police officer David Lee near the Alabama state line after a wants and warrants check showed his Volkswagen Beetle was stolen. When told he was under arrest, Bundy kicked Lee's legs out from under him and took off running. Lee fired a warning shot followed by a second round, gave chase and tackled him. The two struggled over Lee's gun before the officer finally subdued and arrested Bundy. In the stolen vehicle were 3 sets of IDs belonging to female FSU students, 21 stolen credit cards and a stolen television set. Also found were a pair of dark-rimmed non-prescription glasses and a pair of plaid slacks, later identified as the disguise worn by Richard Burton Fire Department in Jacksonville. As Lee transported his suspect to jail, unaware that he had just arrested one of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives, he heard Bundy say, "I wish you had killed me." Florida trials and marriage. Following a change of venue to Miami, Bundy stood trial for the Chiamega homicides and assaults in June 1979. The trial was covered by 250 reporters from 5 continents and was the first to be televised nationally in the United States. Despite the presence of 5 court-appointed attorneys, Bundy again handled much of his own defence. From the beginning, he sabotaged the entire defence effort out of spite, distrust, and a grandiose delusion. Nelson later wrote, Ted was facing murder charges with a possible death sentence, and all that mattered to him apparently was that he had to be in charge. According to Mike Minerva, a Tallahassee public defender and member of the defense team, a pre-trial plea bargain was negotiated in which Bundy would plead guilty to killing Levy, Bowman and Leach in exchange for a firm 75-year prison sentence. Prosecutors were amenable to a deal, by one account because prospects of losing at trial were very good. Bundy, on the other hand, saw the plea deal not only as a means of avoiding the death penalty, but also as a tactical move. He could enter his plea, then wait a few years for evidence to disintegrate or become lost, and for witnesses to die, move on, or retract their testimony. Once the case against him had deteriorated beyond repair, he could file a post-conviction motion to set aside the plea and secure an acquittal. At the last minute, however, Bundy refused the deal. It made him realise he was going to have to stand up in front of the whole world and say he was guilty. Minerva said he just couldn't do that. At trial, crucial testimony came from the Chi Omega sorority members, Connie Hastings, who placed Bundy in the vicinity of the Chi Omega house that evening, Anita Neary, who saw him leaving the sorority house, clutching the oak murder weapon. Incriminating physical evidence included impressions of the bite wounds Bundy had inflicted on Lisa Levy's left buttock, which forensic odontologists Richard Sovereign and Lowell Levin matched to castings of Bundy's teeth. The jury deliberated for less than 7 hours before convicting him on July 24, 1979, of the Bowman and Levi murders, 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder for the assaults on Kleiner, Chandler and Thomas, and 2 counts of burglary. Trial judge Edward Cowart imposed death sentences for the murder convictions. 6 months later, a second trial took place in Orlando for the abduction and murder of Kimberly Leach. Bundy was found guilty once again after less than 8 hours deliberation, due principally to the testimony of an eyewitness who saw him leading Leach from the schoolyard to his stolen van. Important material evidence included clothing fibres, which an unusual manufacturing error found in the van and on Leach's body, which matched fibres from the jacket Bundy was wearing when he was arrested. During the penalty phase of the trial, Bundy took advantage of an obscure Florida law providing that a marriage declaration in court in the presence of a judge constituted a legal marriage. As he was questioning former Washington State DES worker Carol Ann Boone, who had moved to Florida to be near Bundy, had testified on his behalf during both trials and was again testifying on his behalf as a character witness. He asked her to marry him. She accepted, and Bundy declared to the court that they were legally married. On February 10, 1980, Bundy was sentenced for a 3rd time to death by electrocution. As the sentence was announced, he reportedly stood and shouted, "Tell the jury they were wrong." This 3rd death sentence would be the one ultimately carried out nearly 9 years later. In October 1981, Boone gave birth to a daughter and named Bundy as the father. While conjugal visits were not allowed at Rainford Prison, inmates were known to pool their money in order to bribe guards to allow them intimate time alone with their female visitors. Death row, confessions, and death. Shortly after the conclusion of the Leach trial and the beginning of the long appeals process that followed, Bundy initiated a series of interviews with Stephen McCord and Hugh Ainsworth, speaking mostly in 3rd person to avoid the stigma of confession. He began for the first time to divulge details of his crimes and thought processes. He recounted his career as a thief, confirming Clover's long-time suspicion that he had been shoplifting virtually everything of substance that he owned. The big payoff for me, he said, was actually possessing whatever it was I had stolen. I really enjoyed having something that I wanted and had gone out and taken. Possession proved to be an important motive for rape and murder as well. Sexual assault, he said, fulfilled his need to totally possess his victims. At first he killed his victims as a matter of expediency, to eliminate the possibility of being caught. But later murder became part of the adventure. The ultimate possession was in fact the taking of the life, he said, and then the physical possession of the remains. Bundy also confided in Special Agent William Hagmaier of the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit. Hagmaier was struck by the deep, almost mystical satisfaction that Bundy took in murder. He said that after a while, murder is not just a crime of lust or violence. Hagmaier related, it becomes possession that are a part of you. The victim becomes a part of you, and you two are forever one, and the grounds where you kill them or leave them become sacred to you, and you will always be drawn back to them. Bundy told Hagmaier that he considered himself to be an amateur and impulsive killer in the early years, before moving into what he termed his prime or predator phase. At about the time of Linda Healy's murder in 1974, this implied that he began killing well before 1974, although he never explicitly admitted to having done so. In July 1984, Rayford guards found 2 hacksaw blades that Bundy had hidden in his cell. A steel bar in one of the cell's windows had been sawed completely through at the top and bottom and glued back into place with a homemade soap-based adhesive. Several months later, guards found an unauthorized mirror hidden in his cell, and Bundy was again moved to a different cell. Shortly thereafter, he was charged with a disciplinary infraction for unauthorized correspondence with other high-profile criminal John Hinckley Jr. In 1984, Bundy contacted Robert Keppel and offered to share his self-proclaimed expertise in serial killer psychology in the ongoing hunt in Washington for the Green River Killer, later identified as Gary Ridgway. Keppel and Green River Task Force Detective Dave Richard interviewed Bundy, but Ridgway remained at large for a further 17 years. Keppel published a detailed documentation of the Green River interviews and later collaborated with McCord on another examination of the interview material. Bundy coined the nickname the Riverman for Gary Ridgway, which was later used for the title of Keppel's book, The Riverman. Ted Bundy and I Hunt for the Green River Killer. In early 1986, an execution date, March 4th, was set on the Chiamega convictions by the Supreme Court, issued a brief stay, but the execution was quickly rescheduled in April. Shortly after the new date, July 2nd, was announced, Bundy finally confessed to Hagmaier and Nelson what they believed was the full range of his depredations, including details of what he did to some of his victims after their deaths. He told them that he revisited Taylor Mountain, Issaquah, and other secondary crime scenes, often several times, to lie with his victims and perform sexual acts with their decomposing bodies until putrefaction forced him to stop. In some cases, he drove for several hours each way and remained the entire night. In Utah, he applied makeup to Melissa Smith's lifeless face, and he repeatedly washed Laura Ames' hair. "If you've got time," he told Hagmaier, "they can be anything you want them to be." He decapitated approximately 12 of his victims with a hacksaw and kept at least one group of severed heads, probably the 4 later found on Taylor Mountain, Rancourt, Parks, Ball and Healy, in his apartment for a period of time before disposing of them. Less than 15 hours before the scheduled July 2nd execution, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals stayed it indefinitely and remanded the Chiamiga case for review on multiple technicalities, including Bundy's mental competency to stand trial and an erroneous instruction by the trial judge during the penalty phase requiring the jury to take a break, a 6-by-6 tie between life imprisonment and the death penalty, which ultimately were never resolved. A new date, November 18th, 1986, was then set to carry out the Leach sentence. The 11th Circuit Court issued a stay on November 17th in mid-1988. The 11th Circuit ruled against Bundy, and in December the Supreme Court denied a motion to review the ruling. Within hours of that final denial, a firm execution date of January 24th, 1989 was announced. Bundy's journey through the appeals courts had been unusually rapid for a capital murder case. Contrary to popular belief, the courts moved Bundy as fast as they could. Even the prosecutors acknowledged that Bundy's lawyers never employed delaying tactics, though people everywhere seethed at the apparent delay in executing the Archdemon. Ted Bundy was actually on the fast track. With all appeal avenues exhausted and no further motivation to deny his crimes, Bundy agreed to speak frankly with investigators. He confessed to Keppel that he had committed all 8 of the Washington and Oregon homicides, for which he was the prime suspect. He described 3 additional previously unknown victims in Washington and 2 in Oregon, whom he declined to identify, if indeed he ever knew their identities. He said he left a 5th corpse, Donna Manson's, on Taylor Mountain, but incinerated her head in Clover's fireplace. "Of all the things I did to Clover," he told Keppel, "this is probably the one she is least likely to forgive me for. Poor Liz." He described the Issaquah crime scene where the bones of Ott, Nasland and Hawkins were found, and it was almost like he was just there, Keppel said, like he was seeing everything. He was infatuated with the idea because he spent so much time there. He is just totally consumed with murder all the time. Nelson's impressions were similar. It was the absolute misogyny of his crimes that stunned me, she wrote. His manifest rage against women. He had no compassion at all. He was totally engrossed in the details. His murders were his life's accomplishments. Bundy confessed to detectives from Idaho, Utah and Colorado that he had committed numerous additional homicides, including several that were unknown to the police. He explained that when he was in Utah, he could bring his victims back to his apartment, where he could reenact scenarios depicted on the covers of detective magazines. A new ulterior strategy quickly became apparent. He withheld many details, hoping to parlay the incomplete information into yet another stay of execution. There are other buried remains in Colorado, he admitted, but refused to elaborate. The new strategy, immediately dubbed Ted's Bones for Time scheme, served only to deepen the resolve of authorities to see Bundy executed on schedule, and yielded little new detailed information. In cases where he did not give details, nothing was found. Colorado detective Matt Lindvall interpreted this as a conflict between his desire to postpone his execution by divulging information and his need to remain in total possession. The only person who knew his victims' true resting places. When it became clear that no further stays would be forthcoming from the courts, Bundy supporters began lobbying for the only remaining option. Executive clemency. Diana Weiner, a young Florida attorney and Bundy's last perpetuated love interest, asked the families of several Colorado and Utah victims to petition Florida Governor Bob Martinez for a postponement to give Bundy time to reveal more information. All refused. The families already believed that the victims were dead and that Ted had killed them. Wrote Nelson, they didn't need his confession. Martinez made it clear that he would not agree to further delays in any case. We are not going to have the system manipulated, he told reporters. For him to be negotiating for his life over the bodies of victims is despicable. Boone had championed Bundy's innocence throughout all of his trials and felt deeply betrayed by his admission that he was, in fact, guilty. She moved back to Washington with her daughter and refused to accept his phone call on the morning of his execution. She was hurt by his relationship with Diana Weiner, Nelson wrote, and devastated by his sudden, wholesale confessions in his last days. Hagmeyer was present during Bundy's final interviews with investigators on the eve of his execution. He talked of suicide. He did not want to give the state the satisfaction of watching him die, Hagmeyer said. Bundy died in the Rayford electric chair on 7:16 a.m. EST on January 24th, 1989. Hundreds of revelers sang, danced and set off fireworks in a pasture across from the prison as the execution was carried out, then cheered as the white hearse containing Bundy's corpse departed the prison. He was cremated in Gainesville and his ashes scattered at an undisclosed location in the Cascade Range of Washington State in accordance with his will. And that's it for tonight, my little hellhounds. Don't forget to subscribe, click the bell icon, and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. If you have any scary stories you want narrated on the channel, then submit them to Reddit r/homeofscares and follow me on Twitter at homeofscares. Now, good night, my little hellhounds.